It was just me and her, the hum of the fridge a low drone behind us, the warm smell of garlic and onions hanging in the air. I wasn't sure why I'd ended up here. Technically, I was supposed to be fixing a leaky sink for the cafe next door, but somehow I'd offered to chop vegetables. She didn't exactly need me, but when she smiled and handed me the knife, I felt like it mattered that I stayed. She moved with this quiet confidence, almost casual, but there was a weight to her presence, like she carried 100 unspoken stories in the curve of her shoulders. I watched her lean over the counter, adjusting the spice rack, and the way the light caught the fine lines around her eyes made me pause. Not because she was perfect, far from it, but because she felt human, real, layered. I tried to focus on the carrots, but my hands were slower than usual, fumbling with the knife. She leaned just a little too close to straighten a cutting board, and for a fraction of a second, our hands brushed. I froze, and I think I might have even held my breath. She looked at me then, one eyebrow arched, lips twitching like she was holding back a laugh, and that's when she said it. "You're too close already." It was half teasing, half serious. The room fell into a silence that was louder than any conversation. I wanted to laugh, wanted to say something smooth, but instead I just nodded, muttered, "Sorry," and glanced back at the cutting board like it held the answers to life. She didn't scold me or roll her eyes, though. She just shook her head and continued stirring the sauce, humming softly under her breath. I noticed the way her fingers tapped the rim of the pan, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders. Every movement felt like it carried a story I wasn't supposed to read, but couldn't stop trying to. I realized then that I'd been staring. Not in a rude way, I hoped, but in the way you watch someone when you can't figure out how to step back. There was something magnetic about her, something both terrifying and exhilarating. And in that small kitchen, with knives and onions between us, I felt it. The spark of something I couldn't name, something I wasn't ready for but couldn't ignore. She glanced at me again, just briefly, and smiled in that private way she had, the kind that didn't need words to make a point. It lingered too long for just politeness, but not long enough to call attention to itself. My stomach knotted in a way I hadn't expected, like I'd swallowed a secret I wasn't supposed to have. I kept chopping, careful not to slice a finger off, but my mind wasn't on the carrots anymore. Every glance, every small movement of hers, seemed charged with meaning I couldn't place. I told myself it was nothing. She was older, wiser, and probably thinking about dinner plans or taxes or the absurdly stubborn sink she hadn't fixed yet. But part of me, the part that refused to stay quiet, kept replaying the brush of her hand against mine, the soft tilt of her head, the hum of her voice. And when I finally washed my hands, I caught her looking at me again from across the counter. She didn't say anything. She just held my gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary. And in that moment, I knew I would not be able to stop thinking about it. About her, about that small, electric pause, about the way a single sentence could set my entire chest on fire. I hadn't expected to see her again so soon. But there she was, perched on the edge of the worn counter in the same kitchen, flipping through a stack of old invoices with that precise, careful attention she gave everything. I was supposed to help with the dishwasher this time, a clunky, stubborn relic that had been threatening to flood the place since morning. She didn't look up when I entered, her posture tight, shoulders hunched slightly as if guarding something delicate. I felt that pull immediately, the tension in the room, subtle but insistent, like we were orbiting around each other and hadn't quite found the gravity to collide. I busied myself under the sink, trying to focus on the water lines, but I couldn't help noticing the little things. Her hands, for instance, slender, sure, but with faint scars along the knuckles and small, habitual movements that spoke of years of care and work. And when she finally laughed, soft, almost reluctant, it was the kind of sound that sneaks under your skin, the kind you can't quite place but want to remember. At one point, she stretched and sighed, rubbing her temple with a quick, almost apologetic gesture. It caught me off guard, the hint of vulnerability there. She usually seemed so composed, so certain, and yet in that flicker, I saw the weight she carried. The fatigue in her eyes wasn't just from work. It was life pressing down in ways she didn't speak aloud. I wanted to ask if she was okay, wanted to reach out, but the moment passed too quickly, and I stayed quiet, letting the silence hang between us. She glanced my way briefly, her gaze sharp but not unkind, as if testing the waters of how much I noticed, or how much she wanted me to. When the dishwasher finally gave way with a groan and a stubborn hiss, she looked up from her papers, and for a heartbeat, her expression softened. There was a small, almost imperceptible exhale, a release I caught in her chest, as if she'd been holding it for too long. And then, almost on a whim, she brushed a few loose strands of hair behind her ear, a gesture so ordinary, so human, that it felt intimate in a way I wasn't ready to name. I moved closer to check the pipes, careful not to step into her space, but the air between us felt electric despite the distance. She glanced at me again, and for a moment, her eyes lingered on mine, just enough for me to notice the subtle hesitations, the tilt of her head, the brief tightness in her jaw, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She wasn't saying anything, but the room was thick with things left unsaid. And then, as I straightened up from the sink, our hands brushed for the briefest second while I handed her a rag. She froze, her fingers tightening around it for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. I could feel the unspoken charge between us, like a wire sparking quietly in the air. She looked down, letting the moment pass, but the warmth lingered, between her fingers, between us, like a quiet invitation neither of us dared to speak aloud. And I knew, with a certainty I couldn't quite explain, that I would replay that touch in my mind long after the dishwasher had been fixed, long after the kitchen had emptied, long after she had walked away. The rain had started just as I was locking up my bike outside her apartment. I wasn't supposed to stay long, just help her clear out a stack of old boxes in the hallway she'd been meaning to tackle for weeks. But somehow, the hours had slipped past us unnoticed, and the storm made the room feel smaller, warmer, charged in a way I couldn't name. We sat on the floor amid cardboard and dusty books, sorting through papers in silence. The only sound was the occasional tap of raindrops against the window and the quiet shuffle of her hands moving items around. At some point, she leaned closer to inspect a particularly stubborn envelope, and I realized I was holding my breath. My knee brushed hers, and we both froze, not moving, just letting the contact linger for an awkward heartbeat. "I don't think I can throw this away," she said softly, voice barely above the rain. She held up a photograph, edges worn, corners curled. I wanted to ask about it, wanted to hear the story behind her hesitation, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, letting my fingers hover over hers for a second longer than necessary before pulling back. She glanced at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Hesitation, curiosity, maybe even a little longing. I wanted to reach out, to close the tiny space between us, but a sudden phone vibration on the counter yanked us both back. She glanced at it and frowned, a shadow crossing her expression. I didn't need to ask. I knew the name that flashed on the screen would complicate everything. She silenced it with a quick swipe and set it aside, but the tension didn't leave. Instead, it hovered, thick and suffocating, like the storm pressing against the window panes. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt too big for the quiet room. So I stayed still, studying her instead. The faint tremble in her hands, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the soft bite of her lower lip she didn't notice I'd caught. We shifted positions as she reached for a box closer to me, and our shoulders brushed. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, a human pulse that seemed too intense to ignore. My heart raced, but I reminded myself of the space between us, the years, the life she had that I couldn't just step into. So I kept my hands on my knees, kept my voice steady, kept my distance. She looked up, eyes lingering on mine, and for a moment the room disappeared. I wanted to tell her everything I wasn't supposed to feel, wanted to confess that the closeness, the quiet storm, the shared silence, was pulling me in ways I couldn't explain. But the knock at the door broke the spell. Her friend, late and apologetic, waiting in the hall. She sighed and stood, brushing off imaginary dust from her jeans. Our eyes met for one last second, a glance heavy with unsaid things, and I wanted to step closer, wanted to reach for her hand, but the moment dissolved before I could. I stayed seated, heart still thundering, watching her walk away. And even as the door clicked shut behind her, I felt the electricity linger in the air between us, like a spark waiting for a flammable moment I wasn't sure I'd ever get. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes after I arrived. She was perched on the edge of her living room couch, legs crossed, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. I stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, unsure if I should even speak. The air felt heavy, charged, not with anger, not with desire, but with something undefinable, like we had stumbled into a space where normal rules didn't apply. I keep thinking about yesterday, she said finally, voice low, hesitant. I flinched, though I didn't move. The words weren't an accusation, not really. They were a confession. Or maybe a warning. I nodded, unsure what to say. And that was the problem. Nothing seemed small enough to start with. Every gesture, every glance, felt amplified, loaded with meaning neither of us wanted to name. I don't know what we're doing, she admitted after a pause, looking down at her hands. I don't think I've felt this way in years. Her fingers traced the seam of her jeans, as if trying to draw the words out physically instead of verbally. I swallowed, feeling the tight coil of panic and longing in my chest. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that I felt it too, but the words would have made it real, and maybe we weren't ready for that. Instead, I took a step closer, careful to leave space, and let my eyes follow her movements. Every small twitch, the lift of her brow, the quiver of her lips, spoke louder than any declaration I could make. She glanced up at me then, slow, deliberate. Her eyes searched mine, almost asking if I understood what she was saying without saying it. I did. I felt it, every tiny pull and hesitation, every trace of fear and longing tangled together. I don't want this to be reckless, she whispered. And I could see it in her posture, the tension in her shoulders, the slight shake of her hands, that she meant it. Not a moral warning, but a personal one, like she was warning herself. I nodded again, and the silence returned. But it was different now, sharper, intimate, like the kind of silence where truths settle without being spoken. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to bridge the gap between us, but I stayed still, letting the moment exist without ruining it with my need. She exhaled slowly, almost mournfully, then let her head fall back against the couch. Maybe some things aren't supposed to have answers, she murmured. Her voice was soft, but carried the weight of a lifetime of choices, regrets, and careful boundaries. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to argue, to convince her that the question didn't matter, that proximity, time, and silence could be enough. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat across from her, close enough to feel her warmth, but far enough that nothing would change. And then, just before she looked away, she said, almost to herself, I'm scared of what I might feel if I let this happen. The room went quiet again, and in that silence, I realized we were both holding something fragile, something unnameable. And for the first time, I understood that some truths only exist in the space between words. I didn't expect her to pull out the old photograph. It was tucked behind a stack of worn cookbooks, yellowed edges curling like forgotten memories. She held it carefully, as if the paper itself might crumble under the weight of what it carried. I found this the other day, she said softly, almost apologetically. I didn't know I still had it. Her fingers traced the outline of a younger version of herself, smiling beside a man whose absence seemed to echo from the photo. I swallowed. I didn't know whether to speak or just sit there quietly. She glanced up, meeting my eyes with a fragile intensity one hadn't seen before. He was the one I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. And then life happened. Her jaw tightened, and I could see the years of loss etched into the corners of her mouth. The faint tremor in her hands. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the distance between her memory and the room we occupied together. Instead, I reached out tentatively, touching the edge of the photograph with my fingertip. Her eyes flicked down at the contact, just for a second, and I saw the way she flinched, just a little, like she wasn't sure if she wanted me to see that part of her. It's strange, she continued, folding the photograph carefully and tucking it into her lap. I've been so careful, trying not to. I don't know, feel anything that might hurt again. Her voice cracked slightly, and she pressed her palms together like a shield. I thought of everything I'd felt in the past few weeks. The stolen glances, the moments when her presence felt like it pulled the air from the room. You're allowed to feel, I said quietly, not knowing if it was the right thing to say, but unable to stop myself. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment, it felt like the walls she'd built around herself wavered. Her lips parted slightly, and I caught the faintest exhale, almost a sigh, almost a plea. There was no melodrama, no grand confession, just the raw pulse of someone letting a small piece of themselves be seen. And in that moment, I realized how deeply she carried the weight of her past, how much of herself she had kept in carefully labeled boxes, both literal and emotional. And yet, somehow, she was here, letting me sit in the room with her, sharing space with her pain without words. She leaned back against the couch, her hand brushing mine, not on purpose, maybe, but not entirely accidental either. I felt the warmth, the faint tremor, and the unspoken question in the air. Could this moment exist without breaking? I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let the silence stretch, letting the storm of history and hesitation fold quietly around us. And when she finally looked up at me, her eyes glimmering with a vulnerability she rarely showed, she whispered, "I don't know if I can ever forget him, but I think I'm starting to feel again." The words hung between us, fragile and seismic all at once, and I realized I had never felt so alive in someone else's quiet. I still remember the quiet after it all, the small, ordinary moments that somehow felt extraordinary. We never had a perfect ending, never a dramatic confession or a sweeping declaration. Instead, there was the way she handed me a cup of coffee one chilly morning, the brush of her hand as she reached for the sugar, the tiny smiles that seemed to linger a second too long. Looking back now, I realize how much changed between us, not in grand gestures, but in the way we existed together. She learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that letting someone see the edges of her carefully guarded self could feel, somehow, safe. And I learned the patience it takes to sit in silence, to feel something deeply without needing to name it, to treasure moments for what they are, not what I hoped they might become. There were times we almost stumbled, almost crossed the invisible line we both respected but secretly tested. And every time, we pulled back, not out of fear, but out of awareness, and understanding that connection is sometimes more than the sum of physical proximity. It's the quiet, the shared glances, the little kindnesses that don't need explanation. I think about her now and the way she moves through the world, still confident, still layered, still carrying pieces of herself that aren't mine to touch. But there's a subtle lightness in her I hadn't noticed before, a willingness to allow small joys, small intimacies, and maybe even small risks. And I carry that with me too. The patience, the careful attention, the understanding that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers in the spaces between ordinary days. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the smallest gestures, the way she laughed at something I said without realizing it, the fleeting touch of our fingers over a rag or a cup, the shared silence that somehow spoke volumes. It's in those moments I understand what we had, what we still have, in a way that words could never capture. We didn't need a perfect ending. What we had was imperfect, messy, alive, and entirely ours. And for the first time, I understood that love isn't just about closeness or timing or age. It's about presence, awareness, and the willingness to feel, even when it's complicated, even when it's fleeting. I sip my coffee now, remembering her smile, her pause, her hand brushing mine, and I realize that the story isn't over. It lives quietly, in the spaces we shared, in the moments that linger, in the ways we've both changed. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?